The rain came down with a kind of cinematic conviction, big unapologetic drops that blurred the world into streaks of light and shadow, and Tessa Navarro, 29, exhausted, running on the caffeine fumes of vending machine coffee and the adrenaline of 12 hours of triage and triage again at St. Brigid's, hugged her backpack to her chest as if it were something to protect against the onslaught, the night so saturated with water that her scrubs clung to her skin and her sneakers squelched. Traitorously at every step, the curb was an ocean's lip, the street a shining black river braided with the pulsing red and blue of ambulances that did not belong to St. Brigid's but somehow were always a part of it, and beyond the doors where she had just handed off her last patient's chart and silence replaced the cacophony of monitors and the clipped, urgent voices of nurses and residents, the city breathed differently, heavier, as if the storm had put a weight on every chest, her breath fogging the air as the wind found every opening and slid under her collar, down her spine, making her flinch like a violin string being plucked as she searched for the ride-share that her dead phone could no longer confirm, trusting the faint memory of a map and a license plate, trusting the pulse of routine to carry her home to a studio with a window that knew the color of patched Brooklyn skies, there, idling at the curb, a black sedan with tinted windows, sleek as a shark's eye and beaded with rain, wipers metronomic, a driver in a cap leaning forward to inspect, lifting his chin in what she took for recognition, and in that second she decided, that was hers, even if fate had painted it with the wrong plate, even if the universe had annotated it with an extra digit or saved the receipt for later, because the rain was not asking questions and neither was she, pulling the door open like a lifeline, sliding in with the helpless clumsiness of cold fingers and a body that had forgotten how to be dry, a breathless thank you on her lips dispersing into the warm, cedar-scented interior as the door thunked shut with that rethink your life sense of insulation, and it was only then, as the driver eased away from the curb and the city shrugged and the hospital's fluorescent hum receded like a dream you can no longer hold onto, that Tessa noticed the other presence in the car, noticed him the way you notice a painting when the movement around it ceases, the man across from her in the dim back seat, a silhouette first the line of a jaw, a collarbone under a pale dress shirt open at the throat, a hand tightening around a rolled umbrella as if it were a scepter, then a face as passing headlights slashed arrayed planes of light across them, a face she had seen drawn in satirical cartoons and on magazine covers that lined pharmacy racks near the glucose tabs and condoms, a face that had been reduced to shorthand in the city's collective vocabulary, Adrian Vale. The necessary billionaire in suits designed to mislead your eye into thinking they were ordinary, the one who bought failing companies and restored them or gutted them, depending on the headline and the month, the one who donated a wing and took the tax credit, the one they said hid a heart somewhere under those cuff links, the one whose eyes she had never imagined would land on hers as she darted a look and realized at once and nearly sucked in her breath too loudly, her default survival instinct being not to disturb the air of powerful people's bubbles, but his gaze was not the cool survey of a man startled by an intruder, it was curious, almost amused, and his first words were not "Who are you?" but "You look like you've walked through a waterfall," in a voice textured by that mid-Atlantic schooling rich men acquire like a patina, soft and almost conspiratorial, and Tessa blinked water out of her lashes and felt the deep, cellular embarrassment of having chosen the wrong car burn her cheeks, but reflex stepped in the nurse who learns to triage emotions as well as injuries, and she smiled, apologetically and politely, ready to be told to get out at the next red light or find her own way, saying, "I thought I'm sorry my ride-share, my phone died," and she fumbled her backpack open as if she might resurrect the thing with fingerprints alone, the screen a dark monolith that refused to give her even her own reflection, and she was so tired, that the absurdity of it pooled at the corners of her eyes in a way that wasn't about tears, more about salt and relief and the human absurdity of thunderstorms and bad luck piling up, and perhaps it was that, the small, powerless human thing of it, or perhaps it was the fact that they were already moving, engaged in the logic of forward motion, that made him, Adrian. To herself she called him as if she were allowed to, because that was how the city taught you to name its giants, as if they were neighbors you might leave a package with. Say, "It's all right," a hand shifting to press a button between them, murmuring to the driver, "Raphael, can we take her up to Fulton, get her out of this?" And the driver, older, lined, looked into the mirror and nodded once, a slight shift in his gaze acknowledging the soaked, sleep-lost nurse as just another soul who needed to get home, beginning a detour that would, within the hour, cut an incision into every story each of them had told themselves about who they were and what world they lived in, the city outside becoming a blurred aquarium of taxis and strangers, sirens too far away to be their business, the hum of the tires hypnotic, rain-making fingers on the window, Alex North's piano whispering from the car's sound system as if the night itself had asked for soundtrack. She was aware of the quality of the leather under her, of the way her shoes were probably leaving a dam on the rich carpeting, of the faint smell that clung to her antiseptic, sweat, coffee, and the way his attention had a weight but not a threat. And then he said, almost wryly, "You came out of St. Bridget's, didn't you?" And she felt surprised and was not at the same time, because that was the drop-off, because he would have seen the glowing letters through the rain, and because his were the kind of eyes that fed on context, shaping it to fit. "Yes," she said, and added, "because nurses often end up telling the truth to strangers more readily than to friends." Night shift, and the way his head tilted was either empathy or acting, and maybe those are the same thing after enough years of practice. "Rough night," he offered, and she shrugged, the way they all do, minimizing while the images still thunder: a teenage boy weeping while holding his grandmother's hand, a woman in labor held back for an epidural that couldn't come quickly enough, a man whose chest did not respond to compressions, someone else's hands taking over while Tessa counted, 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 the tide of numbers and beeps and blood-soaked gauze, the patient she'd whispered to as the morphine did its work, the way she'd slid the hair off that woman's sweaty forehead and said, "I'm here," while knowing that being here is sometimes all we can gift and yet not nearly enough, and under all of it the systems that buckled and creaked, the supply carts that came empty, the pump that beeped not because it was wise but because it was dumb. "They're always rough," she said instead, and saw the flicker in his regard because he knew the truth of that line, or he wanted to, and she noticed the folders next to him on the seat, paper clasped in old-fashioned clips with the name Vesper Medical on the letterhead, and a drop of curiosity slid along her like the rain outside. Vespera, a company that had become a phantom part of her workday. The intravenous infusion pumps it owned had recently been the subject of memos that read like apologies and threats: use caution, calibrate carefully, do not exceed, until further notice. A pump that had beeped until her ears buzzed the night a patient's blood pressure had sagged into the dangerous low like a boat in a trough. "Do you sorry, is that Vespera?" she asked before she could stop herself, the kind of impertinent question exhaustion gives you permission for, and he glanced down as if surprised to see the brand he was, to some degree, legally married to, and his mouth set into a line that, if it had been on another man, she would have called troubled. "Unfortunately," he said, and as if to punctuate the confession the car juddered as they hit a new river in the road and the driver cursed softly in Spanish and slowed them to a crawl. The city had begun to pool, gravity losing its arguments, and in the expensive aquarium of that car the three humans were suddenly very small, watching the world try to take them under, and yet there was, bizarrely, an intimacy in it, a pocket of quiet in which two strangers might become only minimally less so. It was almost a relief to have something to talk about that was not the rain, to see his glance sharpen the way a surgeon's does when you give them a symptom they've been waiting for. "They're yours," she said, and added, quickly, because she understood greatly how cause and blame circle around one another like sharks, no, I mean your company, not yours, yours, but, and he held up a hand with the grace of a man used to finishing other people's sentences gently, I know what you mean, he said, and his fingers drummed once on the edge of a folder like a heart monitor's blip, it's complicated, and she almost laughed because everything that mattered always was, and perhaps because she was tired or because she had admired courage in her favorite preceptors, she said, it's hurting people, and he didn't pretend to misunderstand, his eyes closed for a breath, not like a man asleep but like a man in prayer, and he nodded, almost a bow, I know, he said, and the rain leaned in harder, and the driver muttered, Senor Vale, and it was only then that Tessa realized she had been mentally using his first name but not saying it aloud, and hearing Vale felt like stepping on a stair you didn't realize was there. It tilted her balance, dropped his face into the new frame, the philanthropist whose name was etched into the silver plaque on the pediatric wing, the man who, according to the last long-form profile she had only schemed while waiting in a dentist's office, had lost a sister years ago to a disease that had taught him to love control, the board member whose vote could recall those pumps or keep them alive another quarter. Tessa's breath hitched not with awe but with that raw, bright feeling when a thread runs through two seemingly unconnected pieces and pulls them taut, the pump that had beeped and the man who owned the company that had made it beep. Before she could decide whether accusation was an appropriate instrument for a person who had been accidentally scooped into his car, the night played its own card. A white van up ahead spit rain like a crazed animal, hydroplaned across lanes and kissed the sedan's front quarter panel with a sound like two fists slamming into a locker, the car lurching sideways, Tessa's palm slapping against the leather, her body anticipating the impact faster than her brain, the seat belt grabbing her ribcage. Like a rough lover as air outside them bent to the logic of velocity and ended, abruptly, in the heavy exhale of airbags unspooling in the front seat and a fine snow of glass whispering down somewhere, Raphael swore again but might have said madre this time. The car's wipers still kept beating like a heart that hadn't received the news, and Tessa's own heart, which had spent a dozen hours sprinting, watched for the cascade that always followed, the check-in, the what hurts, the stay with me voice that had been coded into her by the first trauma bay she had ever stood in while her hands forgot to shake. Are you okay? She said to the air and then specifically to Raphael, who answered SI, bewildered but in one piece, and then to the man across from her whose breath had changed, grown labored as if his lungs remembered something he had suppressed. Adrian acknowledged her with a minute flick of his gaze and brought a hand to his chest, not exactly in pain but in fear of a pain arriving, and Tessa, who had seen the face people make when their body becomes not entirely trustworthy, unsnapped her seat belt even as the car settled into the present tense, moving toward stillness, and knelt awkwardly on the floor, her fingers, those miracle instruments trained to know when to be tender and when to be ruthless, moved lightly to his wrist, finding the thready tremolo of a heart hurrying a little too much, a rate that told her more story than his composed mouth did, and she was not at work anymore, but she was what she was, and that did not pause when the punch clock was off. Do you have any conditions I should know? She said, and he huffed a laugh that had no humor. Nothing I like to advertise, and he swallowed, saliva being in this way more medical than the blue folders. I haven't eaten since. He glanced at a beautiful, discreet watch and seemed to find this amusing through the discomfort. Noon, and Tessa felt the complicated cocktail of nurses' disapproval and something softer. She reached for her backpack like a magician conjuring a rabbit and found not magic but a just-in-case glucose gel packet she had put in there months ago, because once you have stopped a teenager from fainting on a subway by handing them one, you begin to believe in preparing for coincidences. Tearing it open with her teeth and holding it out, here, she said, tongue first, then swallow, and he did as he was told. a thing she suspected did not happen to him. Often, the color warming him by degrees as if painted onto him with a brush, and she was close enough to see that his hairline, perfect in photographs, had that faint human irregularity here, that the pores of his skin were mortal, that his lashes were the lashes of someone who had known sleeplessness. When he breathed again it bore less of the edges, and he said, a shade more wry and more vulnerable, saved by a nurse, and because that sounded like a line he had deployed before in ballrooms. To amuse at least a dozen donors, he added, surprisingly, but not the first time, his gaze sliding away, coming back, hesitant as if the thought had surprised him, as if he had walked into a room expecting a light turned on and found instead a photograph in an old frame he had not known he still had. The rain had decided not to let up. Outside, water now licked the bottom edges of the doors like a dog too familiar. Raphael trying the car a few inches and thinking better of it, saying, we have to get out, se está inundando, and Tessa understood the calculus of rising water and killed engines, a being trapped inside a marvel of engineering that becomes a coffin, and her voice, the one that spoke to families in code, now spoke to these men plainly, grab what you need, leave the rest. We're heading for higher ground, and she shouldered her backpack, noted that Adrian's hands trembled faintly but had steadied, watched him accept this abrupt demotion to a human without a driver in the flood with more grace than she'd expected, opening the door when Raphael did and stepping into a sheet of water that found its way immediately into every seam, her breath stolen again by the cold as they sloshed toward the sidewalk, which offered scant improvement, the rain ricocheting off the awnings like applause at the wrong moment. They moved together, three bodies in mutual need, and the image was almost comic, the richest man she had ever been near clutching a pathetic black umbrella and failing to open it, a nurse and a driver trying to find their way in a city that had pretended it didn't want them for so long but would take their mad dances anyway, Tessa scanning the block with the soldierly awareness of exits and resources. She made for a metal gate half pulled down in front of a bakery she knew, the owner a gentle woman who always saved the day-old baguettes for the nurses with not quite enough in their checking accounts, and she banged on the glass until Suhana's thin, sleep-startled face appeared, then softened with immediate sympathy, her hands already reaching for the keys. The warmth inside was a kind of truce, the smell of sugar and yeast and coffee hiding in the walls, the hum of refrigerators like a reassuring animal, and Suhana shook her head at the tableau Madre de Dios, you are drowned rats, which made sense even though Suhana was Hindu and hadn't meant the literal invocation, and handed them towels, put on a kettle as if everything was normal, and Tessa made Adrian sit on a backless stool and breathe while she was all cool efficiency, and then, because she had learned that sometimes the best medicine is the voice that makes a story out of the immediate chaos, she said, without thinking, you said you were saved by a nurse before. And he looked at the towel in his hands as if it were a script and he had to find the right line, and then he said, my sister, and Tessa's chest tightened in a way that was more than sympathy, because the city's rumors were sometimes true, the story of the girl with the rare disease and the family that had enough money to be told to step out of the room while the doctors huddled, the girl who had smiled in a photograph holding a carnival balloon and then disappeared from the public record, and Adrian said, it was years ago. We were kids, really. My parents were still alive. She had a nurse who told her stories at night, who sat in the corner during the worst of it and hummed, and Tessa, who had once, 8 years ago during her first year on the job, sat by a 15-year-old named Ria whose brother had slept in a chair for 3 nights, who had told Ria narrative after narrative about the Spanish steps and about dogs that can count and about how rain sometimes came in sheets so heavy you couldn't see your own hand, felt something like the floor fall away very gently. She had been an anonymous feature in many families' tragedies and triumphs. She did not expect any of them to find her again in whatever she was now, and so she said nothing, only listened, and Adrian's tone changed, as if he had discovered a trapdoor in his own voice and climbed down into it. When she died, the room was so quiet. I think the silence was what I remember most. There was the sound of, you know, the machines, the air. But there was this, hush. And this nurse, I never learned her name, or I forgot it. She touched my shoulder and said, "You can go on breathing," and I thought it was the oddest thing to say because of course I could. I was breathing, he made a gesture, a small lost movement that made him look decades younger, but I stopped thinking I would. She said it like an instruction, like a permission slip. It was the first good thing anyone had said in days, and Tessa, who had been that nurse without knowing which words had made the difference or whether any of them had, sat in a bakery at 2 in the morning under the gaze of a portrait of Suhana's mother with flour-dusted hands and felt the damp inside her clothes as if it were a tide deciding whether to go out. For a moment the storm felt like it was beyond the windows, a story that only involved them in its metaphor, but there were also facts waiting, and one of them was that Adrian got a phone call, the device buzzing with the suppressed vibration of men who keep the world at that low frequency where only certain dogs hear them, and he glanced at it, winced, answered, "Yes," he said quietly, and listened, and Tessa watched his face rearrange itself into the shell that she imagined had served him well in boardrooms and weddings and the kind of funerals where expensive shoes squeak, and then he said, "No, I'm safe," and then, more softly, "No, I'm not going to the Madison office. If you want to stop me, you have to do it in the open," and that told her more than it should, because she had known from the moment she saw Vesper on his papers that something had brought that folder into this car with that man at this hour, and it was not mere inventory, and now he had said the word stop as if the people he worked with were in opposition to his next act, and you do not learn to read small expressions in families at 3 in the morning and then leave that skill at a door. "Just because there is sugar in the air," she said, when he was off the phone and looking like a man who was not used to being seen while he made decisions, "are you going to recall them?" And he didn't choose surprise or denial or a question as his defense. He said, very quietly, "I was on my way to sign papers to do just that, and then, they prefer I delay until quarter end, the optics will kill the stock, they have arguments that have numbers in them," and Tessa had feelings about numbers that tried to explain away bodies, "and you," she said, and he was so tired too, she realized, not the fatigue of motion and noise but the kind that builds up from carrying a weight that your muscles were not designed for, a kind of moral lactic acid. "I think if I were a better person I would have done it a week ago," he said, and added, as if offering her an out to despise him less, "there are things that bind my hands. Some of them I put there," and she, evaluating not the words but the pulse under them, the way he looked at the door as if something would come through it, said, "Sometimes it takes a disaster to cut a knot," and he looked at her like she had just placed a coin in his palm that he had lost years ago. It was then that Suhana, who had been pretending not to listen, set 3 glasses of hot water down with tea bags she collected like trading cards, and the pause that tea demands, that middle distance between urgency and understanding, gave Tessa space to make a decision that felt small in that moment and would prove to be not. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope she had been carrying for a week without knowing whether to deliver, one of those ridiculous paper envelopes that means more than an email because the ink is your own and so are the misspellings, the kind of letter you write because you like to believe that speaking to power sometimes works. It was addressed to the Vesper board, to the General Council, to anyone who could read. It outlined the number of times the infusion pumps had alarms that did not correspond to actual occlusions, the way their lines kite air when the instructions said they shouldn't, the night a patient had swelled like a myth because the device had been calibrated to a weight that belonged to a different son of a different mother. It was a plea disguised as data, and she had not sent it because she had been told that complaints went into a system, and she had been told that whistleblowing is a career choice, and she had been told by herself that she had rent to pay. She placed it next to his folder of big corporate papers and watched the look that crossed his face, a curious mixture of respect and shame, as if a stranger had brought the proof of his worst day. "You'll need clinical anecdotes when you do this," she said, "all nurse now, all pragmatic compassion. Numbers echo too much in their own rooms. They need the sound of a mother's voice cracking on her son's name," and he nodded slowly, like a man listening to a priest and a judge and a friend, finally saying, would you testify?" And he flinched at his own use of that word, and she paused because she had promised her father she would not become a headline, and because she had promised herself she would not let grief make her reckless. And then she remembered Mr. Alvarez's hollow cheeks and the way the pump had beeped like a failing bird, and she said, "I don't know if I can, not at work, not, but I can write. I can put my name on something. I can stand behind words," and his whole body seemed to ease by a degree, like a knot loosening in the rain. The storm was not done with them. The city's power staggered and flickered, the bakery lights blinked off and on like the eyelids of a giant, a low boom of transformer failure somewhere far enough away to be only an omen, and Raphael shifted near the door and said, watchfully, "We have company," and the phrase belonged to movies until Tessa saw two men in suits on the sidewalk, coats held over their heads in theatrical dismay, radiating a kind of slick purpose that did not belong to the hour or the weather. She watched them with the cold clarity of a nurse watching a family member who is about to go from grief to violence, and Adrian sighed, looked very briefly like a boy who had been found by hall monitors, and said, "They work for my board chair," and Tessa felt the story turn a corner in which the bakery was now a stage for a scene that she had not signed up for, and yet she was present, and that is the only contract that matters sometimes. When the men came in with the deference of people who do not apologize to those they consider service staff, they were damp and smelled expensive, and the shorter one spoke first, ignoring Sahana and Tessa the way a cat ignores furniture, ignoring even Raphael, who took one step closer to them with his hands in fists, saying to Adrian, "Thank God you're safe. The office is ready. We've prepared language for the press," and Adrian looked at him with a weariness that seemed to predate the rain by years. "I'm not going," he said, and the man said, "You'll put us all in a impossible position," and Adrian said, "I know," gently, and the man's eyes shot to the envelope on the table and back to Adrian, triangulating, "You can't do this based on sentiment," and Adrian said, "On evidence," and the man's gaze slid to Tessa then, finally seeing her not as a blur but as a person, and stopped in that evaluative way that made her feel both rarefied and threatened. "The way men quickly calculate the cost of ignoring you." "Who are you?" he said, and Tessa, who had been nurse but had also been devil on worse nights, said, almost cheerfully, "A person who has to get to Fulton Street," and Sahana smiled at that, a knife of approval, and the man looked as if he wanted to insist, to suggest security escorts, to ask whether she had an NDA, to fold everyone back into some demographic he could control. "Mr. Vale," he said, softening his voice the way people do when they think of dispensation, "be reasonable," and Adrian, who had probably been reasonable beyond the call of duty all his life, who had perhaps swallowed himself in the service of the idea of being reasonable, said, "I have been. I am done," and stood up in a way that made Tessa imagine boardrooms falling silent, his height used not as a threat but as a clarity, and in that moment she did not recognize the man from the magazines or the man who had been shivering under a towel with glucose on his tongue. She recognized instead a person who could say no without making it sound like a door slamming, but rather like a door opening to some necessary, wind-filled place where unpleasant but correct things get done. The suits glanced at each other and calculated again, and this time they included Tessa in the math and found themselves coming up short, because there is a moment when the story you have rehearsed fails and you are left with the unadorned fact that you do not want to be the villain in a bakery at 2 in the morning while the city drowns, and they made some noises about tomorrow and discussions and options, and left with the rain at their backs, and Sahana, when the door clicked shut, told the room in her mother's voice that this was, officially, nonsense, and that she would not be party to any more nonsense until she had fed everyone, and set out pastries with the vigor of resistance. It is one thing to say you will do a hard thing in a small, warm room, it is another to walk out into a city that punishes audacity, but sometimes the sky is on your side and disallows business as usual, and when the dawn finally found the courage to pull itself over the horizon, drained and pale like a hospital visitor who had sat in a plastic chair all night, the rain gentled to an apology and buses reclaimed their lanes and people looked like people again. Raphael had by then circled around to retrieve what was left of his automobile. Sahana had pressed a bag of still warm rolls into Tessa's hands as if there were no other way to ensure moral outcomes, and Tessa and Adrian walked along a street that had been briefly a river as if they were returning from a war no one had witnessed, a decision hovering between them like a balloon that might pop at any moment. It carried them into a cab that smelled faintly of cherry air freshener and cigarettes, carried them through neighborhoods where people hosed off their stoops as if washing was a language that could cure the night's excess, carried them to a building off Madison that looked like every building where decisions get made about the futures of people who do not get a say, and they went not into the paneled office his colleagues had prepared but into the small, modern conference room that faced the street, on purpose, with windows that would allow his announcement to be as visible as possible where even pedestrians might sense the shift, and Tessa sat across from him while he picked up a phone like a weapon and called in his general counsel and said, "We're doing it," and then called a journalist from a national paper and said, "I have a statement on the record," and then called a regulator from a number marked only DC office and began a conversation whose language made Tessa's ears ring with acronyms and consequences. She did not understand all of the choreography but she understood the line of his body as he performed it, the steadiness that had replaced the tremor, the steadiness you see in the person who picks up the code card and knows exactly which drawer has the epinephrine. The room filled with people and then emptied, the air changed pressure, and at a certain point he looked at her like a man who had become, abruptly, only himself, said, "I have to go upstairs and be torn apart for a while by people who consider me a traitor. You should not be here for that," and she nodded because she knew what it was to be torn apart and to refuse to let the family see, and he added, "Can I ask you something before I am rearranged?" And she nodded again, and he said, "That nurse, the one who said what she said to me when my sister died, was that you?" Looking at her not like a billionaire would expecting the world to shape itself to his hunger but like a brother asking for the last piece of evidence that will allow him to make the math balance, and Tessa, in whom humility and pride had been braided into a thick rope since she was 12 and realized that her mother's wages would not always stretch to food and tutored other children in math for $3 an hour, Tessa, who did not want to be anyone's story because it meant the story had a pain, said, with a breath that tasted like a bakery she would probably come to think of as a church for the rest of her life, "Yes," and then, because she had learned that let be is a false god when truth might be a bomb, "your sister's name was Ria. She liked the peaches from the vending machine even though we all know they taste like wax," and his eyes did something then that no photograph had ever captured. They softened not like butter, which is lazy writing, but like ice catching sun, and he put a hand over his face for a second and he breathed and then he said, not elegantly, not with any of the turn of phrase he had paid for in schooling, "Thank you," and the words were not for the present only but were back rent paid on the past. With interest, and then he stood because the day demanded him, and he said, "Wait," as if a new idea had inserted itself into the flow. This was not an accident, was it? But he shook his head at himself. Of course it was. You were trying to get home, and yet he trailed off, looking at the ceiling as if it were a field of stars he was only now learning to read, and then, the slightest smile, what strange mercy the rain can be, and left, a small army of lawyers flowing in his wake. In the days that followed, the city did what it always does, absorbed shock and moved on, but the internal organs of institutions do not heal so fast, and Tessa learned about the formal language of retaliation and about her own resilience in the face of it. There were emails from administrators at St. Brigid's asking for a meeting to clarify certain statements, and there were whispers at the nurses' station from those who admired her nerve and those who warned her she had made herself a story. And there was one patient's daughter who hugged her so hard the bones of Tessa's back popped when she said, "You're the only one who tells the truth," and there were late-night messages from Adrian's assistant Elodie, her voice always steady, saying that the company had indeed issued the recall, that the stock had indeed taken a bath, your phrase. Elodie had said, amused, but that the phones were ringing not only with investors but with clinicians who had turned their heads toward Vale's company for the first time in months without a curse on their lips, and there were articles written in the kind of prose that looks like a knife and acts like a mirror, and there was, on a grey Tuesday when the rain decided to visit again like a friend you had to feed, a small ceremony at St. Brigid's lobby where no ribbon was cut but a notice hung, Vale Innovations Foundation Nurse Safety Initiative, with a list of grants for staffing and training and a silent line about free self-defense classes for night shift nurses, and someone whispered that a man had written the check with a trembling hand and then had returned to his car and breathed like a person who had been given oxygen after a long interval of suffocation, and Tessa laughed privately at the melodrama of that, because the truth of it did not require poetry, but the poetry was there. Anyway, there were calls between her and Adrian where sometimes they said nothing much beyond logistical notes and sometimes they fell, as humans do, into the wound of the past, and he told her about how he had wanted to be a doctor once, briefly, before money had made itself a promise too delicious in his ear, and she told him about the time she had sat on the roof of her building and watched the city spin like a record under the stars after a shift that had broken her, and they did not make anything ridiculous of it, did not set the world on fire with their closeness, did not tumble into each other's arms, because the story they were telling required slower muscle. They became allies, a word she had not known could taste good in the mouth. The unexpected twist, everyone else said when telling their version, the elevator pitch, the story to dine on, was that the tired nurse who had stumbled into the billionaire's car had been the anonymous savior of his sister all those years ago, as if the city had decided to arrange a symmetry in repayment for all the asymmetries it delivered at random. But the actual twist, the one that mattered to Tessa and to a smaller, fiercer piece of Adrian than he had thus far acknowledged, was that the rain had insisted on a pause long enough to dismantle a machine that had been humming toward harm because the humans inside it thought they had no choice, and that rainy night turned out to be the slot into which they inserted a tool to jam the gears. Not forever, nothing is forever, but long enough to buy breath for a few and change the course of a few days for 1,000. There was a day, months later, when the blossoms on the stunted trees on Tessa's block did that brave thing of blooming even though the air still held cold, and she walked out into it after having slept 9 hours in a row for the first time in years, and there was a black sedan parked across from Suhana's bakery that made her smile without flinching, and there he was, standing in a coat that made him look like the kind of man who could buy coats for other people too, his hair a little longer, a little less severe, his eyes carrying a life that belonged not just to quarterly earnings but to faces he had seen. They walked without making a plan to Prospect Park, and she told him about a new patient whose laugh had made everyone else in the unit laugh in helpless contagion, and he told her about a meeting where he had said no again and his opposition had learned to hear that as a full sentence, and somewhere near the lake where geese named their territories by honking like old men arguing over a chessboard, he told her he had written a letter to his sister and wanted to show it to her, and she said she would like that, and he did, and it was awkwardly written and sincere and contained one sentence that made her breathe in and hold it. Tessa is the nurse who gave me that permission to breathe, and sometimes when the night is too long I say it in my head again, and she laughed at the odd circularity of being thanked for so simple a thing, and he smiled with that lopsided relief of men who have never learned that crying is allowed, and the rain began, lightly this time, more like a suggestion than a command, and they didn't run, they let it find their hair and their faces and their shoulders, and he looked at her, not with gratitude or with debt or with romance as the movies spackle it on, but with the recognition of a fellow being who had been caught out in the weather and had grown used to it and had not, despite everything, stopped giving people permission to breathe, and it struck her then that that was all anyone ever needed to be, not a billionaire, not a nurse, not a savior, not a scandal, just a person who tells someone else it's okay to keep breathing.